All right. Let me just start. That way it'll be more quiet when I come in. Okay, let's go back. Do you have last week's outline at all?
No.
Yep.
I don't.
Okay. Well, go to Zechariah 14. And we want to go back to verse 9. I just want to review this for a second. It says, in verse 9, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. Okay? Now, in other words, the point is that when Messiah returns and establishes his kingdom, there's not going to be any other game in town.
Right.
There will not be United Nations. There will not be a G20. There will not be Islam. There will not be Buddhism. There will not be agnosticism. There will not be diversity teaching. There will be no longer any moral relativism. All those things that are the pet elements of the liberal mentality will be done. Okay? And you'll see as we get to the end tonight, at the very end, the last two verses makes it very clear how done it's going to be and to what extent. Okay? Now, we talked, actually last week, I believe, was about the Rift Valley. And I told you that the Rift Valley ranges from the Dead Sea, or from, you're only seeing the Dead Sea part there.
It shows the Rift Valley.
Yeah, but it doesn't show, it goes up to the Sea of Galilee.
Oh.
Actually, well, I guess I didn't look careful enough. Let me see.
There's the
There.
Sea of Galilee.
All right. So, literally, the rift goes from up here, Sea of Galilee, goes all the way down the Jordan River Valley, goes into the Dead Sea, goes all the way down into the Gulf of Aqaba. Well, it goes further than that. It goes then under the sea and goes all the way down into the famous Great Rift Valley of Africa. It's all one huge rift, geological rift. Big. Now, let's read verses 10 and 11 of Zechariah 14.
We're gonna, we want to finish Zechariah today. That's why we started.
That's okay. That's
Okay.
okay.
And
No
also
problem.
we have communion afterwards.
Oh.
Joe is doing. So,
Okay. So, 10 and 11, all the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, from the tower of Haneel to the king's wine presses. Now, if you will go to, why don't you go to the picture of the topography. This is what we think. Let's see if I can make it bigger. This is a picture, this is a drawing of what we think it will look like. Now, it's described, and of course it's at least going to be somewhat right. I don't know if you can see that any better at all.
we can see it.
But what you see here is that it's going to extend from this area here called Geba, this town. It's about 10, now currently it's about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. It can extend all the way down into the walls of Jerusalem. Here, of course, is the Kidron Valley in here. It's going to extend all the way down to this ancient town that's been around since the days of Joshua, the conquest, called Rimmon. This is about 35 miles south of the end of Jerusalem here. This is about 10 miles north. So you have about maybe, the better part of close to 40 miles. And this will be a huge plateau. It's going to raise up and everything around it, well, either everything around it is going to be suppressed or it's going to raise up, whichever way you want to look at it. Okay, it's going to be a huge plateau, and that's the way it will be during the millennial reign. I just wanted to show you kind of a picture of that because we went over it here the other week. Now, in verses 10 and 11, we see here that also that all the gates will remain the same in the ancient city. So let me go. I gave you an idea of here the gates of the ancient city. All right, if you can see, I'll put it down a little bit like this. Okay, this was the way the walls worked and when the walls were built during Nehemiah and Zerubbabel and Zechariah's day. So you see here, let me get the pointer here. Okay, now some of the gates have had several names to them. Okay, so they're not universally over a period of thousands of years called exactly the same thing, although some of them are always called the same thing.
Excuse me. So all Jerusalem had wall around it, or just the temple?
Oh no, the whole
city.
The whole city had wall around it.
Had walls.
Yeah, Golgotha would be up here, and just outside, right here, almost just outside the Sheep Gate area. Okay, and then the area that we believe is the Garden Tomb, if we're right about that, is right to the west of it, more or less, over here, just outside the gate, very, very close. Okay, the Skull Hill. You can go out that one gate and look at the front of this cliff. This is the best way to put it. And the way it has two dugout areas for eyes, it has an area for the mouth. That's why it's called Golgotha, the Skull Hill. It looks exactly like a skeleton, a skull. So you have all of these different gated areas that some of these are gated names and some of these are places. Like you have the Water Gate, but then you obviously have the projecting tower. You have the Fountain Gate. Then you also, down here at the very south end has always been the Dung Gate. But basically the gates that are mentioned in here are basically telling us that all these gates from the north, northwest, northeast, and south are all going to be there. Okay? So they're all the same. They're not going to go away. And that will be, again, will continue to be the perimeter of Jerusalem. It's not going to change in that sense. Now, it also states here, if you'll notice, that not only will all the land be changed and there will be these gates, but as I said, of course, the Lord will be king over the earth, and He'll be the only one, and His name the only one. Now, all the nations will worship and serve Messiah. They will not have a realistic option at this point. We have to try to appreciate the change that's going to go on as a result of the beginning of the millennium. And we're going to see more and more changes as we go on and finish off the chapter here. All right? All of the, as I said before you guys came, all the diversity teaching and all that stuff, gone. He is the king over the earth, and all the nations will recognize Him or pay the penalty for not recognizing Him. In Psalm 72:11, I might go there and read it to you. There are some verses about this. Of course, it was predicted a long time ago that this would be the case. I'll just read 72:11. Get my fingers to work. That's always a question. And it's where it says, "And let all kings bow down before Him, all nations serve Him." Okay, David predicted that. David knew that from his own seed, from his own genetics, eventually Messiah would come and He would be king. But of course, a far greater king than David ever was. We also see this in Psalm 102:15, similar idea, Psalm 138:4, Psalm 148:11. And also, we see a similar thing in Malachi. I'll read this to you. Malachi 1, verse 11 says, "For from the rising of the sun even to its setting, my name will be great among the nations. And in every place incense is going to be offered to my name, and a grain offering that is pure. For my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord of hosts." So you see how Jewish everything's going to become. All over the world in reality.
It's going to be very different. It's kind of hard to imagine Chinese
Yes.
nation.
Absolutely.
Jewish ruling.
That's exactly what I'm saying is it's going to be a radical change. Now, as I said, Jerusalem will maintain its current walls and its current gates from the northern side to the northeastern side, northwestern side, and even to the very south side. And of course, the reason why is, of course, this will be the earthly throne of the Lord. He will literally be in Jerusalem. We see this mentioned in Jeremiah 3:17 and Isaiah 2:2-3. I'll turn to the Isaiah section here and show you Isaiah 2:2-3. He says, now it will come about that in the last days the mountains of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. Now you know why it's a big plateau. Okay? And he says, it will be raised above the hills. Isn't it interesting that Isaiah knew this? And Isaiah lived way before Zechariah lived. Be raised way above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
Wow.
That's going to be a different world, isn't it?
Wow.
You know? And it says, I'll read verse 4 too. And he, Messiah, will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples. And this is where we get this famous verse next. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Isn't it interesting? We try all these efforts at peace. We've had this. It's Isaiah 2, verses 2-4. We've had thousands and thousands of years of trying to maintain peace. We finally, of course, had the establishment of the United Nations, which is supposed to make for peace, which is a laugh, because when has it ever made for peace, really, in any way at all? You know, and, you know, you think of all the peace treaties that have ever occurred, but the history of the world doesn't go more than about 80 years before there's another war. And there's ethnic things that go on way before that. In terms of major wars, think about, we had World War I, started in approximately 1913-14, all right? Then we had a peace treaty in approximately 1917, the end of the Great War. By 38, 37, with the beginnings of World War II occurring, we finally have a peace treaty, in 1945. Then, of course, in 1950, we have the Korean War that starts, which goes for several years. And then we have, not really a peace treaty, kind of an armistice that goes on. And then within 10 years, less than 10 years, we have all these troops being sent into Vietnam. We have the French presence that's been there for years. We have advisors sent, and by certainly 66, 67, we have a good roaring war going in Southeast Asia, including multiple nations. That comes eventually to an end in 73. We just go on and on and on. And of course, as long as mankind has the ability to try to make their own decisions in all these things, there will always be war. There will always be poverty. There will always be social problems. We see in this country today the social justice people that are making for tremendous difficulty, shouting down people, saying they don't have a right to free speech anymore, going to Charlottesville, Virginia, going to Boston, going to these various cities. We have the Black Lives Matters people. We have the new Black Panther movement. We have all these groups, and all these groups, of course, believe that they can install a different government, in this country. That's their goal, stated goal. And they end up believing that they are going to contribute to a globalist system. And of course, every time we've had any kind of globalist effort of a dictator, in the world, what do we end up with? We have oppression. We have prejudice against certain groups. We have genocide. We have impoverishment. And look at Russia as an example. You know, you had a relatively wealthy, middle class in Russia that had farms like her grandparents did, you know, that produced cattle, that did all these things prior to 1917. The communists take over as a result of the October Revolution. What's the first thing they do? They confiscate everyone's private property, because this is an injustice against the people. Only the state should have property. Individuals should not own property. So they steal all the wealth of the middle class. And what does everyone become as a result of the October Revolution in Russia? Equally poor. That is what socialism always leads to. Equal poverty, except for one group. There's one group that isn't poor. Exactly, the elitists that are on top of it. They never submit. They never live like they say everyone else should be. They own property. They have all this wealth. They take all this privilege. You know, and as long as we have that kind of mentality and that kind of avarice and that kind of sinfulness in humanity, there is no system that will ever undo it. Only this system will undo it.
That's right.
Only God reigning on earth will undo it. And these people, after thousands of years, will not accept this. The day will come that they'll have no choice but to accept it. And then we'll have peace. And then we won't have poverty like this. And then we won't have disease going on. And then we won't have ethnic wars, etc., etc. But only then.
It's interesting to imagine how it's technically going to happen. Like, to anyone on the earth. We probably will never know till the very end.
Yeah. Now back to Zechariah 14. Let's keep going towards our goal of ending Zechariah tonight. Okay? Also, you notice, it says that, verse 12, and people will live in it, and the people will live in it, and there will be no more curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security. Now, how long has it been since Jerusalem ever dwelt in security?
Never.
Well, there have been a few times that it dwelt. During Solomon's reign as king, you could say Jerusalem lived in security. Even during David's reign, they had a civil war, okay? So it really wasn't very secure during that time. It was certainly better than a lot of times were. At least you didn't have foreign troops, all over the land. But, then you had the Greeks invade. You had obviously the Babylonians invade. Then you had the Median Persians invade. Then you had the Greeks invade. Then you had the Romans invade. And after the Romans caused the diaspora in 70 AD, then, of course, you no longer had a Jerusalem that was really inhabited primarily by Jews for almost 2,000 years. So there's certainly no security that way. And it's only since 1948 that we have some sense of security in Jerusalem, although that security is always being affected by rocket attacks, by terrorist bombs, by people overwhelmingly saying we want to annihilate the Jews, we want to get rid of them, we want them out of there, saying we have a right to Jerusalem, etc., etc. So this will be a huge change for Jerusalem to have this type of security. And of course, there'll be no more curse. We've said this many times. Deuteronomy 28 is a key chapter in the Old Testament. It talks about the blessings and the cursings on Israel. And it tells us all the things that are going to happen to the Jews as a result of not following the Lord. And they've all happened over and over again. Terrible things have happened to them. And they're listed in there in that chapter very specifically. But all that curse will be done. The word curse is the word karim, and it means a thing dedicated to destruction or something trapped in a net. It's used in many places, but certainly in Joshua 6, 17, and 18. The point is that all the efforts to entrap, encircle, invade, and destroy Israel will never occur again. All the strategies will come to an end.
It's going to be different.
Notice that in Zechariah 8:13, that we studied who knows how many months ago, says that it will come about that just as you were a curse among the nations, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so I will save you so that you may become a blessing. Do not fear, let your hands be strong. That's what Zechariah was told to say. I want you to notice also this. In the history of Jerusalem, for those of you who like statistics, it's endured 36 different wars, 50 different separate invasions, conquered 20 different times. The city was leveled 17 times and was rebuilt 18 times.
Wow. I think you'd give up after a while.
A lot of destruction, a lot of invasions. It's a bloody history. It's a very bloody history. Now, let's move on to verses 12 through 15. Let's read them of Zechariah. Now this will be the plague which the Lord will strike on all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in the sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth.
Lovely.
And it will come about in the day that great panic from the Lord will fall upon them. And they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one another will be lifted against the hand of the other. And Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and all the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver, garments in great abundance. So also like this plague will be the plague on the horse and the mule, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps. Now, this is a very graphic, but I'm certain for Zechariah and for people for literally almost 2,000 years, a very enigmatic description. What kind of disease could they ever imagine? Okay, that their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot out of its sockets, and their tongue will literally rot in their mouths.
Reminds me of zombie.
I can't imagine. I can't think of any disease entity that is known so far that this would describe. So let me tell you what I think it may have reference to. I think it's possible it has reference to a neutron bomb. Now, there are tactical neutron bombs and there are large neutron bombs. Let me tell you a little bit about neutron bombs because I researched a little bit about neutron bombs.
I really don't want to know. No.
A neutron bomb produces 10 times the neutron output than a regular nuclear weapon. So the amount of neutrons go at a speed that they penetrate through almost anything.
Yeah.
So it's like you're made cheese when the neutron bomb goes off. Now the interesting thing about a neutron bomb is, you know how when you look at a picture of a regular nuclear explosion, if you've seen it, like when they've taken down, put up these little cities and then they drop the bomb and then you see they're absolutely flat. That flat comes from the pressure wave that's created by the atomic blast. Mm-hmm. It's a tremendous pressure wave. I mean, it'll take anything out that's standing, no matter what it is, concrete, you name it, it'll take it out. But a neutron bomb doesn't have a pressure wave. So what happens is its destruction is only on biological tissue. So the building stands, okay? And the wooden structure, if it's even relatively far away, and I'll show you how close and how far this works, it stands. So anything that is inorganic is not affected by it. It's only organic tissue that's affected. Actually, I found that this bomb they found that can be engineered to even target certain types of protein structures more than other organic structures. You know, kind of creepy.
Already nowadays.
Oh yeah. Well, we've had them since the late 50s, and they've been more and more developed. Everybody has them. Russia has them. China has them probably. Okay. Now, its effective range is limited to a few hundred yards and not miles. Matter of fact, in the literature I looked at, they said that the effect of the neutron bomb, particularly if it's a tactical one, like they shoot it like an artillery shell or tactical one, okay, is usually 600 to 1,000 meters. It's that short.
Half a mile.
Right. But, of course, it kills any biological tissue in that 600 to 1,000 meters. Now, it was reported in 1984 that the Israelis had manufactured many of these for tactical battlefield use. So we have plenty of evidence that the Israelis have them, as well as other. So, it's there in their armament. They've got it. Now, I would suggest this. Despite what this interpretation may mean, let's assume it's a correct interpretation, that it's describing a neutron nuclear weapon. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but I think it's the best we have to understand it, at least at this point. I think we still have to say that there's absolutely a supernatural element that's going on here, because if it goes off, why does it not kill all the Jews?
Right.
They're there, as well as the enemy troops in Jerusalem and the surrounding area, but doesn't kill them. And I think it reminds me of the angel of death in Passover in Exodus 12. That the blood kept the Jews, their oldest, from being killed. And I think something similar probably is going on here in a supernatural sense. So the Jews
Then they were developing to not be able to, to pick out only certain.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah, who knows exactly what they really have. Obviously, no one's going to know exactly because they're not going to let anyone know. Now, the second element that's mentioned in here in these verses is that there's a panic and confusion that is undoubtedly supernatural in nature and supernatural in its effects. We've seen this before. Go back literally a few chapters to the 12th chapter of Zechariah. And look at verse 4. Everybody talks about the cup. Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples. And he says, it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. And all who lift it will remember. We went over those so many weeks ago. Look at verse 4. Let's remember it. In that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment and his rider with madness, and I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So, clearly there's going to be another supernatural effect here.
Okay,
And
where you just read?
I read Zechariah 12:4.
12:4.
Yeah, 12:4.
Okay.
So, what he's saying is, and of course we've seen this before. God's done this before. I noted here, we've seen it in Judges 7:20 through 22 with Gideon. And we've seen it also in 1 Samuel 14:15. God has times in which He supernaturally strikes people with blindness, enemy troops, etc. And what apparently happens here is that it creates a level of panic that literally turn against each other and start to kill each other. That is the invading troops that are in Jerusalem. Every man's hand will be against the other.
It reminds psychotropic weapon, which influence people's minds.
That's true. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, and the DARPA stuff that they've developed, certainly, in the United States, DARPA, and certainly in other countries too, where they have psychological weapons where they've basically, conditioned.
Something in the air,
And
the
before,
whole crowd.
and you hit a trigger, whether it's a sound or whatever, people literally go mad. DARPA has that kind of stuff. It's creepy what DARPA has when you start to look at it. That's a good point. DARPA is the defense. It's the defense research arm of the United States. It's called DARPA.
There's also sonic weapons that they have that drive you crazy.
Yeah.
Do all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's a lot of things like this there. But again, if it isn't battlefield stuff, then certainly we're also talking about panic and confusion directly caused by the Lord in a supernatural way. Now we also see here that, remember back in Zechariah 14, back at the beginning of our chapter, he says,
Go back to 14.
yeah, go back to 14 and go to verse 1. He says, behold, a day is coming from the Lord, for the Lord, that the spoil taken from you will be divided among them. Okay? In other words, when these invading troops come in, they not only take half the city, but they also start to rob all the Jews of everything. And here we see that in verse 14 of chapter 14, and Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver, garments in great abundance.
Now,
So in other words, the stuff they'd stolen goes back to them, plus more. And whatever they've accumulated or brought with them, that also gets taken by the Jews as a result of this. So it's very interesting how in a relatively short time it all goes back. Now, let's look at verses 16 through 19. Let's read it. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if a family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall upon them, and it will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Now, it's stated that Messiah will require attendance each year to the fall feast. It talks about that they have to be there for the Feast of Booths. It doesn't make any sense to me that they'll be there just for the Feast of Booths. My opinion is they're going to be there for all the feasts, probably, because they all occur in a row, consecutively by days. I think probably they'll all be there. Now, of course, the consequence of not sending representatives is on all of the nations, or most of the nations, drought will occur, except for Egypt. There's an exception for Egypt. It gets two things. It gets drought and plague. Those two. And I put in the notes here, any idea why?
So they're super bad.
Well, I don't know if they're necessarily... there's a lot of nations that have done terrible things to Jews, but I think historically, there's a historical reason why. Where were they held captive first? In Egypt. What had to release them from captivity? Plagues. And I think that's probably the reason why if their representatives don't come, then their country will get a double dose, as it were. Yeah. So the point is that God requires that people show Him respect. It is not optional at this point.
and not showing respect is punishable.
Absolutely. He already tells right up front, if you don't do this, this is the consequence. It will occur. So, as I said, the Feast of Booths, when we went over, why don't you put the feast up? Here. All right.
The first statement says, then all the survivors from the nations. What survivors?
That's a good question. Because you don't know how many actually even do survive. But then again, remember, it's primarily the armies of these nations that come into Israel. Their people are back in the world wherever they are. So they don't come. But even though they don't come, any of their battle troops that actually do survive will then be required to do this, but certainly the whole world will be required to do it. Here I pointed out, I think this is a good chart. I think it's an excellent chart. And I don't know if you can read it from back there, but
I'm sorry.
okay. So here's the 7 festivals. You have Passover first, and of course God, Elohim, delivers his people from bondage of slavery in Egypt. That's obviously what is practiced there. And Messiah fulfills that by his death on a tree provided atonement and redemption. So this is the tradition that's going to be fulfilled when Christ is crucified and dies for all sins, okay? The blood on the wooden doorposts, right? Okay. Then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which follows days after you have Passover. And this is it's where Elohim purifies his people. And of course, we see that Messiah was without sin. In other words, he's unleavened, okay, without sin. Then, of course, we have the first fruits, festival of first fruits. Elohim provided food that is a barley harvest for his people, because the Passover is built around when the barley is ripe. Okay, so if they harvest the spring crop at this time, and of course you have Messiah's resurrection presentation to the Father as the first fruits among the dead, right? As we're told in the epistles. Right. Then we have the Feast of Pentecost, which is the one in the middle, 3 and 1 and 3. Remember, it's the one end of May, early June, depends on the year. But at the Feast of Pentecost, of course, God, this is the time where God on Sinai gave the law. That's the time of Pentecost, back in the time of ancient Israel. And of course, here we see that Messiah has sent the Spirit to enable believers to obey the Torah, okay, the law. So this is the fulfillment. Then, of course, we have the last 3 that are in the fall. We have the first one, the Feast of Trumpets, right, blowing of trumpets. The trumpets are blown to begin the countdown to the Day of Atonement when it starts. This is a time of repentance for the Jews. Okay? They're supposed to consider all the sins that they've committed for the previous year, just as many as they remember, and to humble themselves about the sacrifice that's going to be made for the nation. Okay? And of course, then the fulfillment is the announcement of Messiah's return in esteem as Messiah ben David. In other words, how many times do you have, look at Revelation, what are they called? The trumpet judgments. All the way through Revelation, you have trumpets being used over and over and over again, announcing different elements of preceding Messiah coming. Then, of course, the next one is the one that is the official Day of Atonement, called Yom Kippur. It's the cleansing of the sanctuary and purging of sin from the camp. That's its purpose. It's the paying of sins for the nation. Okay? And, of course, Messiah atones for his people and judges and destroys sin. It's the ultimate fulfillment of the Day of Atonement. Then we have the one we're talking about here, the Feast of Tabernacles. It's
the famous Feast of the Booths?
Yes, Tabernacles or Booths. Same idea. It's remembering of Elohim dwelling in a tent with his people, Israel, in the wilderness and in entering the promised land. In other words, what happened? They would camp once they were released from Egypt, and what would be there? By day would be the pillar of cloud, and by night the pillar of fire. And of course, and God would literally be there. His presence would be there with them all the way to Sinai. And then, as also said, then he leads them back, which we're going to talk about starting next week, when we're going to start into the book of Joshua. And he leads them back until they finally get a hold of the land again. And again, he does miraculous things in his presence there. You're going to see a ton of miracles in the book of Joshua. Okay? So he Elohim tabernacles with his people in person, in the presence of, what did it say? The person of Messiah. So, back to Joshua here. The Feast of Booths occurs, again, as I said, after the fall feast. It's a thanks to the Lord, and it was a time of joy and celebration. This was a party time. They were happy about the harvest. They were happy that the Day of Atonement had taken away their sins for that year. You know, this last part is supposed to be a fun time. You know, have a party.
How How can you remember how many sins you've committed in a year?
Well, you can't remember them all. The point is they're supposed to be...
Making notes.
Yeah, that's right. Make a note every time you think you sin.
You have a wife that remembers.
That's right. Very good. Yeah, you don't have to write it down for yourself. I endorse that idea. Absolutely. So, what we also see here, turn to Revelation 21:3. I want to show you, like at the opposite end of the Bible, how this is all meant to be and all planned to be, and what God starts in the beginning, He ends up weaving His way through history until He accomplishes what He intends to accomplish. Look at the very end, Revelation 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and He shall dwell among them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself will be among them. You know, think, as it were, if you want to turn here, you don't have to turn here, but back to Genesis 3. Let me read verse 8. And they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. Think about it. Prior to this time, prior to the sin of Adam and Eve, they had daily walks with Elohim, with God Almighty, every day in the cool of this garden. He was right among them every single day. You know? But of course, the nature of sin changed all this. But God's plan is going to make it all right. Now, let's read back to Zechariah again here. Let's read the last couple verses. It says, 20 and 21, the last two verses of the book. In that day there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the bowls before the altar. And every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. And all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And there will be no longer a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. Wow. Now, go back to Exodus. Because you say, why does it say holy to the Lord? What's the deal about that? Well, go to Exodus and go to chapter 28 of Exodus. And we're going to look at verses 36 through 38. He's talking about the vestments and equipment that were made for Aaron, the high priest. So we're going to start at 36. You shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it, like the engraving of the seal. Say it. Holy to the Lord. That's where it comes from. And you shall fasten it on the blue cord, and it shall be on the turban, the headpiece, in front, and it shall be at the front of the turban. And it shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate. Okay? So, in other words, as Aaron, as the representative of high priest, will be used, okay, to take away the sins of Israel, so will the presence of Messiah at this time on the earth consecrate the whole earth. The whole earth. You can not even imagine that, can you?
It's hard to picture in your mind.
Okay. It's mind blowing. You know, think of the change that's going to occur. Think of all these people that do all these things, that believe they can change God's law, they can institute social change any way they want it, they can redefine marriage, they can go on and on and on in terms of all the distortions of truth that have occurred over thousands of years. And of course it seems to have been accelerating in the last particularly 50 or 75 years, to an unbelievable level, these people are going to have a very, very stark reality that's going to hit them. Okay? Assuming they make it at that point.
Yeah.
Assuming they would make it at that. And that would be, everything is going to be consecrated and holy to the Lord.
It's probably God's going to make some changes on DNA level.
I don't know. Turn from Exodus way back to 2 Corinthians. I thought this verse in 2 Corinthians really, it came to my mind while I was studying this, and I think it really kind of depicts the spirit of this. Paul said it in 2 Corinthians 2. It's verses 14 through 16. It's a very interesting statement by Paul. 2 Corinthians 2, 14 through 16. He says, "But thanks be to God, who always leads us in His triumph in Christ, and manifests through us the sweet aroma of the knowledge of Him in every place." Okay? In other words, think of it. When you come into a group of fellow Christians, okay, you sense it. You feel it. There's a spirit of similarity among everyone.
As well as you feel the opposite.
Yeah, and then, of course, there's the opposite. You go into some kind of meeting or situation where it's predominated by people of this world. They're advocating these horrendous things, and you smell the opposite, if you want to put it that way. Let's go on in that passage. He says, "For we are a fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved." Okay? It's those people that smell it. Those who are being saved. And among also those who are perishing. To the one, an aroma from death to death. That's the perishing. Don't you sometimes read articles, look at things on television, and have this sense? I do all the time. It's just this aroma, this atmosphere of death. It just pervades, it just pervades the situation. It's just this heavy, I don't know how else to put it. It's this heavy atmosphere where you're in a certain situation, you go, man, this is just not of God. It's bad. It's negative.
Well, the reason, where they're trying to tear down our history now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. My reaction is, how stupid can you be? I mean, that was my reaction.
Well, it is stupid. And let me add to that, Ian. It's a very good observation. It's stupid for a reason beyond the logical stupidity of this is our history, and how you're going to change history. History should be learned from, not changed. You have all that. But let me add one more thing that they are completely not understanding. Let me give you an example again of the Russian Revolution. In 1917, the October Revolution, when Lenin, Trotsky got everything going and they eventually took over the government in Russia, they developed this group of people that did their work. And you know what Lenin called them? Called them the useful idiots. That was his term for them, the useful idiots. He would whip them up with his rhetoric, right, dear? Okay. He would whip them up with his rhetoric, and then they'd be sent out to go into the villages, to go in the countryside, to go in the cities, to wage, their righteous battle for communism. All right? He's not the only one that's done this. Okay? In China, what did Mao do? What was the Cultural Revolution?
It was a propaganda.
Okay? Same thing. You whip up the young. You give them this idea of we'll have justice and all this.
Everything will be beautiful.
You get them in a frenzy. You get them to hate those that would oppose them. They go out. They march in the streets, etc., etc., etc. Okay? In every case we've had this kind of revolution, you have people that are the useful idiots, most of whom have almost no idea of even what they're doing, to go out in a spirit of hatred and oppose the existing regime, whatever it is. Now, part of what they do after they've had a little bit of success is they decide that they cannot let any symbols or emblems of the former regime exist. So what did they do, dear, after Trotsky and Lenin successfully implemented this Russian Revolution? What did they do?
Destroyed cultural inheritance, killed Tsar, of course, and palaces and all the history.
And the architecture and the art and the beauty. They tore down. If I got the number, I read it in that one book. I think I got the number right. The communists either changed over or tore down 1,200 different churches in Moscow.
In Moscow.
In Moscow itself.
Just in Moscow.
Yes. A lot of them they tore down, burnt down, and some they turned into warehouses and things, for the revolution.
Hundreds of churches around the country.
Yes.
Hundreds.
I'd say thousands of them around the country.
Thousands, yeah. And of course, when in 90s Perestroika began.
What began?
Perestroika.
Gorbachev, that kind of stuff, okay?
Mm-hmm.
They came and destroyed the monuments to Lenin.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So,
right. Yeah.
Now, you see, and this is the thing. If I were, just as an example, okay, I'm not, but if I were there and speaking to them and a bunch of them wanted to destroy monuments to Lenin, once the government was been over, the communist government over, I'd say, no, don't do that. Let it be there and let people learn from it. Okay? Don't destroy it. See, and this is the problem. When these people are going to tear down these statues, what they're doing is they're attacking the history and the culture of those people in the South. They're trying to redo it, and what are they predictably going to do when they go far enough? It always happens. For every action in physics, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if they keep doing this, there's a very predictable historical outcome that will occur. There's going to be a conservative, white backlash against them. It will happen. Because it always does.
yeah.
It always does.
Why are they? I know we all say they're being paid and so on and so forth. I mean, how can they be this angry? So many of them.
Because they've spent now, 40 or 50 good years in the universities teaching communism, teaching socialism, teaching against white privilege, that white people are privileged because they're white. Apparently there aren't any poor white people anymore. They're only privileged white people, okay? And they've been teaching about social justice for 40 years in the universities. It's gotten more strident, it's gotten more combative, it's gotten, and now you literally can't even hardly speak up in a university if you're a conservative student because you'll be shouted down. They won't even have a discussion with you. It's become an emotional approach. It has no logic to it. It has no reason to it. It's just this hate-filled, emotional approach. I'll give you another example. In South Africa, for years and years and years, you had the Dutch colonists that had white farms. And, of course, they had all kinds of laws that limited black Africans. Okay? People that probably merited moving up, people that, it was, a colonialist system that discriminated against black Africans. And that's wrong. It's not ideal. And what they didn't understand, unfortunately, was if you keep a system like that going, eventually someday there's going to be a backlash. So Nelson Mandela starts a movement. Okay, interestingly enough, he's supported by the socialist. He's trained as a socialist. Okay, and he has that background and mentality. He goes and he becomes a famous person because he's in prison for this for years. He spent 10 or 12 years in prison because of it. Eventually, he's let out. Okay. Eventually, there's enough of a revolution. Eventually, he's elected president of South Africa. And now, what do you see in South Africa?
It's destroyed.
You see the opposite. You see that you can't be a white person and be in the government. You can't be a white person and get grants anymore from the government. You can't be a white person and have, their equivalent EPA comes into your farm and says, well, this is not right. We're going to confiscate it. They're confiscating farms. there's been a tremendous killing of white farmers in South Africa. I mean, and here's the point also. When they're killed, do you think that the police investigate? No. See, it's the exact opposite. You go from prejudice against blacks to prejudice against whites. See? It always happens. And this is why what these people are doing is so dangerous. Because they go far enough, it will create a backlash.
And also, many of them seem young. I mean, like
They are.
under 30 or
That's who always gets a revolution going. The Cultural Revolution in China. It was a... Pardon? Okay. It was a youth revolution.
It's
So
an endless topic.
it is an endless
I'm
subject.
sorry, I may have...
That's okay.
forgot.
Okay, now, so let's talk about these cooking pots. Basically, what is said here is even the common cooking pot of the average person will be like Aaron's bowls that he did use for sacrifices. Even the bells on the common horse's harness will be inscribed with "Holy to the Lord." Everyday life will become all oriented about Messiah and worshiping Messiah. It'll all be sanctified by His presence. Every element of it. So there, as he says here,
So we'll not be crock pots, but anymore.
it goes holy is the Lord on the side of it, on your crock pot. Absolutely. Holy, yeah. So back, I got to turn back to 14 again here. So every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts, and all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And he says there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts that day, which means there will no longer be anyone who's an idol worshiper. Idol worshippers, gone. Okay? Gone. So, literally, things are going to be that changed in this kingdom. Now, in conclusion, this book is about the fact that God's intended purposes will be fulfilled. We studied from chapter 1 to chapter 14. That's what it's all about eventually. It will be fulfillment that we find in Isaiah 7:14. I'll read it to you. It's a famous verse. You've heard it many, many times. Therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with a child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. That's been God's intention from the garden to what will occur in the future. God is making His way through history in His plan so that He can eventually be on the earth with His children. All of them. Not just Jews. All of them. Okay, at this point. So the drastic and lethal change which occurred in the Garden of Eden will be reversed eventually. It will be no more. And mankind will fulfill again what was said in Genesis 3:8 about walking in the cool of the day with the Lord. They will come, it says, present their cases to Messiah, and He will decide among them. He'll be the judge system. He'll be the Supreme Court. He'll be the government at that point. And of course, I'm certain there'll be a lot of administrators to that government, because we have implication of that in the Gospels. So, here's the summary of Zechariah, chapter by chapter. Now, you're getting worried when I say that. It'll be quick. Turn to chapter 1.
Another 14 weeks.
Yeah, that's right. 14 more weeks, right.
All right.
Go to chapter 1. Okay? The vision of the horses and the riders. The rider on the red horse shows up. You remember? In the myrtle trees? So chapter 1 is about Messiah as the riding one. Okay? Chapter 2. We have the vision of the surveyor who's laying out Jerusalem. Okay? So we have Messiah as the measuring one. Number 3. We have the vision, in chapter 3, the vision of Joshua the high priest. And what does he do? He talks about cleansing, the need for cleansing of the people. So we have Messiah, in the symbolism of the high priest, as Messiah as the cleansing one. Then we go to chapter 4. And we have the vision of the golden lampstand. And we talked about that lampstand. I actually even drew a picture of it. I think a rather good one. So we have Messiah as the empowering one. The Spirit comes through this lampstand and, of course, becomes the source of all things. Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The vision of the flying scroll. And, of course, the law being on both sides of that huge piece of paper. So we have Messiah as the judging one, talking about their violations against the law of God. That's what was talked about there. Chapter 6, we have the vision of the 4 chariots. And, of course, the judging nature of those. And, of course, this is, and of course, also we have the crowning of Joshua that occurs from verses 9 on. Remember, Joshua's crowned, and they combined the priestly office with the prophetic office, and of course, it's speaking of Christ. Okay,
Right, because the other two couldn't be the same.
So we have Messiah as the crowned one in chapter 6. Then in chapter 7, he talks about these weird fasts that they'd made up. Now, they made up and kind of distorted the Torah law in this way. And, of course, we have then Messiah as the rebuking one. He's telling them, no, you're going off the rail here in terms of Torah law. No, no, no. Chapter 8, even though he rebukes them in chapter 7, in chapter 8 he goes back and there's a blessing involved here. And he's kind of soothing them, promising them. And in chapter 8 we have Messiah as the restoring one. He's going to bring back Jerusalem. He's going to restore things to the people. Chapter 9, we have in chapter 9 we have the burden of the Lord. We talk about the victory of the Maccabees. We had this reference to Alexander the Great. And then we had the coming of the King in verses 9 and 10. So here we have Messiah as the kingly one. Chapter 11. Or that's 9, I'm sorry, chapter 10. Go to 10 now. And here, in chapter 10, we have the blessings from Messiah. Talk about the rain from the Lord at the time of the spring rain, yada, yada. We had all these talking about the blessings and all these things. So, of course, chapter 10 would be Messiah as the blessing one. In chapter 11, we got all this discussion about shepherds. Good shepherds, bad shepherds, and the false shepherd, or the idol shepherd, which, of course, is the Antichrist. So that is here Messiah as the shepherding one. And in chapter 12, in the second burden, or second oracle that he's given, we have the Lord's care for Jerusalem. And we have here talking about Messiah coming back. So it's Messiah as the returning one in chapter 12. In chapter 13, we have a discussion about a sword against my shepherd in verse 7, and against my associate. He will strike the shepherd, the sheep may be scattered, and I'll turn my hand against the little one, etc. So here we had talking about the prophecy that Messiah would be smitten, would be killed. So we have Messiah as the smitten one in chapter. That's chapter 13. And then chapter 14 that we just finished, we have the Lord's second coming to Jerusalem. We have all the events surrounding it and the installation, of course, of the 1,000-year millennial rule. So we have Messiah as the reigning one. So I think that's an interesting way to summarize this.
So it's all about Messiah.
It's all about Messiah. Now, I want to say this. Tonight, we're here, and we're going to have communion, and then we're going to have singing. We're singing with it. Next week, I'm going to start. I've decided I really think we should take the book of Joshua. It is an absolutely remarkable book. Its spiritual application to our lives today is incredible. Its history is incredible. Archaeology is incredible. The prophecy in it is incredible. And, of course, the big reason, of course, why I pick it, because it has the giants in it. Of course, I can't resist that.
Love giants.
You and your giants.
Can't resist it. So, at any rate, it's a fantastic book. And so next week, I'm going to do the introduction to Joshua.
Okay.
Okay?
Are we gonna have more people? Are they all fall away now?
Well, in another week, not next week, but I think the week
Me, seriously.